Initial statistics on candidates' answers to a controversial DSC history exam question. Japan lifts a state of emergency for Tokyo and 4 other regions. And in the UK, Boris Johnson says his chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, acted responsibly despite alleged lockdown breaches. Hello and welcome. No new local cases of COVID-19 were reported in Hong Kong today.
In Japan, meanwhile, the government is lifting a state of emergency that has been in place in Tokyo, 3 surrounding prefectures, and Hokkaido in the north. The edict will see coronavirus restrictions removed. Officials are ending the decree due to lower infection numbers. The state of emergency was supposed to be in effect until May 31st. Also in Asia, South Koreans will be required to wear masks when using public transportation and taxis nationwide starting on Tuesday. Face coverings will also be mandatory on all domestic and international flights beginning Wednesday. Next month, owners of high-risk facilities such as nightclubs, gyms, and karaoke bars will be required to use smartphone QR codes to register customers. The technology will make it easier to track infections.
The UK Prime Minister is standing by his top aide who was accused of breaking lockdown rules while coming down with COVID-19. Boris Johnson says Dominic Cummings acted responsibly, legally, and with integrity. Peter Caveus has details.
UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson did not fire his chief aide for allegedly violating national lockdown rules he helped to create. Dominic Cummings drove the length of England while infected with the coronavirus. Britain's lockdown stipulated people remain at their primary residence, leaving only for essential local errands and exercise. Cummings traveled to be near extended family because his wife was showing COVID-19 symptoms. He correctly thought he was also infected and wanted to ensure his 4-year-old son was looked after. The Prime Minister agreed with those actions.
I think he followed the instincts of every father and every parent, and I do not mark him down for that. And though there have been many other allegations about what happened when he was in self-isolation and thereafter, some of them palpably false, I believe that in every respect he has acted responsibly and legally and with integrity.
Cummings did not speak to the media about the matter, but the country's opposition leader did.
This was a huge test of the Prime Minister, and he's just failed that test. He hasn't sacked Dominic Cummings, he hasn't called for an investigation, and he's treating the British public with contempt. Millions of people across the country have made the most agonising choices not to visit relatives, some of whom were ill, dying, not to go to funerals. They deserve better answers than they got from the Prime Minister today.
One answer UK citizens did get was when schools had reopened. Primary school students will return to class June 1st as part of Phase 2 of a lockdown easing strategy. Elsewhere in Europe, parks and bars opened in the Spanish capital as the country eased measures. Starting today in Madrid, bars allowed to open terraces at 50% capacity, and people will be permitted to meet in groups of up to 10. For the first time in months, people gathered in St. Peter's Square at the Vatican for the traditional Papal Blessing Sunday. Pope Francis has been delivering a blessing from inside the Apostolic Library during the new coronavirus pandemic. Greece restarted regular ferry services to the islands as the country accelerated efforts to salvage its tourism season. Travel to the islands had been generally off limits since a lockdown in late March. Peter Caveus, TVB News.
Elsewhere, big crowds turned out for the Memorial Day weekend in the United States amid warnings from authorities about people disregarding the coronavirus social distancing rules. The U.S. leads the world with more than 1.6 million confirmed coronavirus cases and more than 97,000 deaths. On the eve of Memorial Day, New Yorkers got a reprieve from cabin fever after weeks of coronavirus quarantine. The state's ban on gatherings was eased just in time for the weekend.
We come outside with my friends trying to enjoy a little bit of the beach. We have a little bit of lunch, dinner over here, and I'll play a little bit of volleyball.
While locals can head to New York City beaches, they shouldn't expect to get in the water, and they'd better be wearing a mask. The swimming ban remains in effect possibly for all summer. New York's governor announced the state's major sports leagues will be allowed to start their training camps immediately.
We want people to be able to watch sports to the extent people are still staying home. It gives people something to do. It's a return to normalcy. So we are working and encouraging all sports teams to start their training camps as soon as possible, and we'll work with them to make sure that can happen.
Some regions of New York will begin the first phase of reopening this week as the coronavirus death toll trends downward. The number of daily deaths currently stands at about 100, down from a peak of 799 on April 8th.
Disney's closed. Universal's closed. Everything's closed. So where did everybody come? On the first warm day with 50% opening, everybody came to the beach.
In Virginia, protesters gathered near the Trump National Club to let the president know they were teed off. Trump departed the venue after spending most of the day playing golf. The protesters were angry about the administration's handling of the coronavirus pandemic.
The White House has announced it will restrict travel from Brazil to the United States 2 days after the South American nation became the world's #2 hotspot for coronavirus cases. The restrictions, which go into effect on Thursday, are a blow to Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who has followed the example of U.S. President Donald Trump in addressing the pandemic. In Brazil's capital yesterday, Bolsonaro greeted anti-lockdown protesters, posing for photographs. He's been widely criticized for his handling of the outbreak amid a deepening political crisis. Bolsonaro's supporters also hit the streets in Sao Paulo to call for an end to the restrictions and the resumption of economic activities. Brazil has reported more than 363,000 cases of the new coronavirus and 22,666 deaths.
Well, the Examinations and Assessment Authority has initially reviewed candidates' answers to the scrapped Diploma of Secondary Education History exam question.
Nearly 40% of them agreed with the question, which asked if Japan did more good than harm to China during the years 1900 to 1945. Kana Chu has more.
Furor surrounding a controversial history exam question continues as statistics on candidates' answers emerge this afternoon. The contentious question that appeared on the recent HKDSC history paper cited 2 pieces of information and then went something like this. Japan did more good than harm to China in the period 1900 to 1945. Do you agree? According to an initial review, 38% of candidates agreed with the proposition, while 57.1% disagreed. The remaining 4.9% were neutral. The Special Legislative Council Education Panel meeting deliberating the matter also heard 17% of candidates deemed there was only good to the historical event. That's in contrast to an overall of 78% who acknowledged harm. Last Friday, the Examinations and Assessment Authority asked a question following mounting criticism that it was romanticizing Japan's invasion of China. But the education chief maintained the decision was not politically incentivized.
If we ask the students, secondary 6 students, to analyze these 2 pieces of information within a short period of time, and normally these 2 pieces of information will not be taught at in a normal lesson of a school, then it will be very difficult for them to give a very meaningful analysis.
He also noted a working group will be set up to look into the question-setting mechanism for history subject. Kana Chu, TVB News.
Well, today, several Beijing officials and a former leader of the SAR waded in to promote national security legislation. Jackie Lin with more.
The repeated refrain in championing the controversial national security legislation from Beijing is as loud a message as in its tone. This as Vice Premier Han Zheng weighed in at a meeting in Beijing last Saturday with Hong Kong members of the National People's Congress. The top dog overseeing Hong Kong affairs says the laws are necessary to punish a fraction of the city's populace who advocate Hong Kong independence and rioting so as to protect the vast majority of law-abiding citizens. He maintains the laws would ensure a stable environment for the city to resolve its deep-seated economic and social issues. Closer to home, Hong Kong's former chief executive Tong Chee-hwa, who's also a vice chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, rehashed similar sentiments. Enough is enough, lamented Tong. He contends Hong Kong people have been living in trepidation since the social movement unfolded, and the best cure is national security legislation. Stacking blames on foreign forces, he says their aim is to work against China's peaceful ascent in the world. Also joining the chorus of support is the Foreign Ministry Commissioner in Hong Kong.
There is absolutely no need to panic or worry that you may be unfavorably impacted.
Trying to assure foreign consulates and chambers of commerce, he says the laws will create a more stable business climate for investors. But also some sterner remarks.
No country will ever turn a blind eye to the illegal acts that may jeopardize its national security. It is simply unfair for any country to stigmatize and demonize others' efforts to plug national security loopholes.
And no mincing of words when it comes to press freedoms that might undermine national security.
The freedom of the press is a right, and more importantly, also a responsibility. Media professionals should abide by the code of ethics instead of abusing their freedom or spreading disinformation and even undermining national sovereignty and security under the pretext of the freedom of the press.
Jackie Lin, TVB News.
The city's last British governor says the G7 should stand up for Hong Kong's freedom as Beijing plans to pass a new national security law for the city. In an interview with the Financial Times, Chris Patton says the United Kingdom should ensure China's efforts to impose the law are on the agenda for the G7 meeting in June. The 76-year-old says Hong Kong people have been betrayed by China. Patton is leading a coalition of more than 200 international lawmakers and policymakers who are opposing the proposed legislation. The White House's national security advisor has suggested placing sanctions on Beijing if it passes the law.
We strongly encourage China, the mainland China, not to impose this law on Hong Kong. If they do, I can't see Hong Kong remaining an Asian financial center the way it has been for many, many years. With the 1992 Hong Kong Policy Act, the 2019 Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, both require the Secretary of State to certify that Hong Kong maintains a high degree of autonomy. And I don't think it's going to be, under the current circumstances, especially if the law is passed, it's hard to see how Secretary Pompeo could make that certification. If he fails to make that certification, there are consequences that come with it, sanctions and others.
Still ahead on tonight's news. Chief Justice issues a statement about a district court judge who sympathized with a knife attack defendant. Renowned Chinese language tutor Wesley Xiao slapped with 14 months in prison. And online applications for wage subsidies under the government's employment support scheme now underway. Welcome back to TVB News. The Chief Justice today issued a statement about a district court judge who sympathized with a defendant in a knife attack at a Chung Kwan-o Lennon Wall last August.
Jeffrey Moss said the judge's unwarranted expression of his political views during the court proceeding could have undermined the public's confidence in the judiciary. Haley Joe reports.
Judges must refrain from unnecessarily expressing in public, including in judgments, any views on matters that are controversial in society. In his statement, Chief Justice of the Court of Final Appeal Jeffrey Ma said he had spoken to District Court Judge Kwok Wai-kin. Last month, Kwok jailed a man for 3 years and 9 months for wounding 3 people with a knife at a pro-democracy lantern wall in Cheongwon-o last August. But in his judgment, Kwok said the defendant, who is a tour guide, was a victim of the social movement, and protesters who hurt ordinary citizens were no different than terrorists. The Chief Justice said there is a risk some reasonable, fair-minded and well-informed people could reasonably take the view that the court's impartiality may have been compromised. Ma said Kwok agreed with this. He added Kwok would continue to be barred from handling protest-related cases for the time being. Legal sector lawmaker Dennis Kwok welcomed the move.
I welcome the statement made by Chief Justice Jeffrey Ma today regarding a recent district court judgment which has undermined the professionalism and impartiality of the Hong Kong courts, which is most unwelcome at a time such as this.
A pro-Beijing legislator said the same guidelines should also apply to those judges who express views in favor of the social movement, saying they should be withdrawn from protest-related cases too.
I hope that the same guideline also apply to those judges who have anonymously expressed their political views in some of the very controversial political issues.
Haley Zhou, TVB News.
A star tutor will spend 14 months behind bars for conspiring with 2 examinations and assessment authority examiners to obtain confidential information about HKDSE Chinese language oral exams. Wesley Xiao was sentenced at Tunmun Magistracy after being found guilty of 2 counts of conspiracy to commit misconduct in public office in 2016 and 2017. The 2 examiners were also slapped with jail terms and 8-month custodial sentence for one and 5 months imprisonment, suspended for 2 years for the other. While handing down the sentences, the magistrate criticized Xiao for undermining the fairness of the public exams.
A principal fireman will serve jail time for indecent assault. Chen Yu Hong was convicted of 6 counts of indecent assault and 3 counts of common assault. The 52-year-old was sentenced to more than 8 months in prison for attacking 2 female subordinates at multiple fire stations dating back to August 2018. The magistrate called Chan's behavior shocking and reckless as he committed the acts while in the presence of others.
At least 35,000 applications have been received for wage subsidies under the government's employment support scheme. The first tranche of the program covers the months of June, July, and August. Starting today until June 14th, eligible businesses can apply for wage subsidies online. The handout for each worker is capped at $9,000 per month. That is expected to be dispersed 3 to 4 weeks after applications are submitted. Under the scheme, employers cannot implement redundancy and must use the funds solely for its intended purpose or face penalties. Self-employed persons with MPF accounts before March 31st can also apply for a one-off lump sum subsidy of $7,500.
Hong Kong is trying to revive its badly hit tourism industry from the lasting impact of the coronavirus and social unrest in the city. It also comes amid economic concerns over the proposed national security legislation. But as Dong Yao Nie reports, the Secretary for Commerce and Economic Development sees the law as being beneficial to the city's tourism and business sectors.
Hong Kong, the one-stop shopping paradise and international travel hotspot, is now struggling to attract tourists. Today, the Secretary for Commerce and Economic Development, Edward Yao, said the industry is facing its worst-ever crisis. But he sees Beijing's planned national security law as positive for both international investments and tourism in Hong Kong.
I think the draft decision to be made by MPC is one that is needed for Hong Kong. Many chambers and international interlocutors, they are also expressing the concern whether Hong Kong would continue to be a safe city. So I hope the draft decision when passed, and could also help to ease their mind that, well, Hong Kong would be able to cope with the situation to avoid social unrest.
But a pan-democratic lawmaker has the opposing view.
The national security law will just further enhance the image of Hong Kong as a police state. I just don't see how that could ever revive Hong Kong's international tourism.
The government is facing pressure from tourism groups to save travel agencies that have been hit hard during the epidemic and from recurring protests. In response, the Tourism Board announced a $1.12 billion fund and a three-step revival plan for the coming year. The measures include spurring domestic tourism with discounts, establishing close cooperation with specific overseas tourist areas, and rebranding Hong Kong's international image as a tourist destination. Dong Yao Nie, TVB News.
That is the news. Thanks for watching.
Good night.